I will introduce you then. So, because you look very similar on the photo. Yeah, well, anyways, so you are like a postdoctoral collaborator at the Center for Interdisciplinary Women's and Gender Research at the TU Berlin. You published just recently the book, which was mostly focused on the liberation in post-war France in connection to decolonization and the notion of like some kind of political transfer of the different meanings. You are mostly concerned also about with the feminist theory and history of feminism of the second half of the 20th century, if I understood it correctly. So yeah, I would like to give the word to
Yeah.
So now I speak in German again. But we're also changing the time because and also the place, because I want to look into the West and the time of the bloc confrontation. And I am also continuing the talk by Christina Tümaroa because I also wanted to look at the notion of liberation. I was especially interested in the self-design of the new women's movement as a liberation movement. And I will show this with the example of the women's movement in France. To look at this notion, the liberation movement, I want to put it on a different level and want to ask about the language and also the metaphorical images it creates, because the problem that feminists described and how was it developed, and in this time when they speak about the oppression of women, which words did they use, what tools did they use to make this a political topic. I want to show with this that the specific rhetorical strategies and the self-designs that are also seen in the local context in France, that these self-inventions do something, because the oppression of women is concerned, and they also mark the political agenda, and they also determine who can speak in the context of feminism and who is seen as a feminist voice. And when we heard Christina Tümaroa, we heard that in this symposium, that when we talk about emancipation in the 20th century, we have to also ask about the ambiguities that it comes with when we talk about the political notion of liberation, of freedom. And what I want to show you, that when we talk about these notions, we always have to think about what else it implies. Okay, so first of all, women's movement as a liberation movement. Like in many other Western countries, in France in the 60s and the early 70s, the feminist activism started to develop. It started to become this women's movement, and they described themselves as a liberation movement, and that was a key moment in the late 60s and the early 70s, to see themselves as a movement, to understand themselves as a Mouvement de Libération des femmes. And in the end of the 60s, they started to call themselves that, a liberation woman movement. And we speak about also borrowings from the US women's liberation movement. One of the texts which has the references to call the women's movement a liberation movement is a manifesto from 1970, which was written by authors from France and from the US. And this manifesto called for the liberation of women by themselves. Like the Black Power in US or other liberation movements in the colonies, the women take their own struggle into their own hands. This is what they write. They are subjects like the colonial victims or the slaves. And the central point of the manifesto is that the gender relationship is a relationship of exploitation in which women build a political class. We talked about that after Christina's talk. But to make clear that women are experience oppression, they have to stand up and they use the metaphorical transfer to other oppressions like colonialism. Like the citation is, women are like a colonialized people within the people. Though you can compare women to slavery. So we have to liberate women in all different kinds of fields, not just to overcome the society of classes. So the primal place for the liberation struggle, which was especially true in the 70s, the feminism of the 70s, that the liberation struggle has to take place in the matrimony, in the family, in the household, and sexuality. And I want to point out the meaning of racism and colonialism and slavery are also in this argumentation have to be included in the argumentation to struggle for freedom. When the political agenda was formulated, they used comparisons and borrowings, and they used the metaphorical language when talking about racism and colonialism. This manifesto is a prime example to show the argumentation with comparisons and pictures that use the historical context, like the modern the slavery on the plantains, and describe their status. We're still talking about the time of the early 70s. You have both complexes, racism and colonialism, in different kinds of forms. They were used as a power relation and different groups, but also the movement of resistance. So we have racism and the blacks in America and the civil rights movements and black powers. And when we talk about colonialism, you talk about the colonized and anti-colonial liberation movements. And to have these reference points and these comparisons serve to understand the situation of women and to think about their situation and to see the relationship of gender as a relationship of exploitation and to name it as a relationship of exploitation, like racism, like colonialism and slavery. So these metaphorical borrowings we use to make the situation a problem, as it has not been named as a problem before in the discourse. And by naming it as such, it will be put into political context and will be brought out into the world. So I want to say, as much as racially motivated violence is ostracized, also sexually motivated violence should be ostracized. As well as colonialism was fought, also the oppression of women should be fought. And also what is very important is that the black people in the US took their struggle into their own hands, and the same way the women took their struggle into their own hands, a fight for self-determination. And as I mentioned before, in the French context, or if you compare it to the German context, it is a similar story. Of course, we use different images, maybe, but the context in the autonomous women's movement in France was the radical left wing side, and they wanted to separate from the other fighting strand, because they wanted to be the anti-colonial resistance was in their focus, that it was their own revolutionary struggle. The idea was, if anywhere in the 60s there were revolutionary incentives, then they should come out of the liberation struggles of the global south, and not anymore the traditional role models of the east, like the unions and so on. So in this context, the new autonomous women's movement developed, which is separating itself from the other, but they're using the same vocabulary. The problem of this self-design as a liberation movement is also the problems of the description of the statues or of the situation. When you speak about women in exploitation compared to slavery, you can take the example of the campaign for reproductive rights. I wanted to use this as a prime example because the fight for the reproductive self-determination was one of the big mobilizations in the early 70s. And the women's movement's activism became famous, and it was a difficult factor in the political process about the liberalization of contraception and also abortion. At the same time, their movement became more visible and contributed to that more and more people were mobilized to create like a huge mass movement. A slogan that they used in the mobilization was "Maternité esclave," the slavery of motherhood. They used two aspects that they scandalized as a slavery. First of all, the force to reproduce that women have to face, and on the other hand, the exploitation of care that they also called slavery. So the slogan of motherhood as slavery, they demanded the reproductive rights, and this was only based on a very specific experience, because the reproductive freedom and the decision for a child or against a child is very specific for a certain group. Because we know there's also forced sterilization and forced contraception. So they did not consider that also the deprivation of motherhood should also be a part of the campaign. I found proof that this was not considered in the campaigns. That forced sterilization was also practiced. So this metaphorical language shows certain experiences, but it also forgets other experiences. For example, a group of black women of the former colonies of the French overseas territories, where the problem was the forcing of sterilization. The white women's movement knew about this. I saw this in different magazines in my research, but colonialism and migrational problems were not understood and not carried on, because in the hegemonial agenda it was not introduced, and it did not cause any irritation. They only called it specific problems from black women, for example circumcision, and yet some topics like that were like genital mutilation. They got their way into the white women's movement. When the situation of women was described, the comparison to colonialism was still used, but they did not really include those women who were concerned. The liberation of women was always thought of a certain stand of the white perspective. Now I come to my conclusion. This symposium is called Milestones of Emancipation, and in Europe after 1968, of course we had these milestones, and they were fought for by the women's movements, also that violence against women had become a political topic, and so on, self-determination, reproductive rights, and so on. But what I would like to focus on is what I mentioned before. There are so many ambiguities with the notion of emancipation, because we have those milestones, but they're only referring to very certain women, and they're not relevant for all women, and they're not liberating for all women, just for a small group. And we can't speak about that woman or the oppression of those women. It didn't work, because not all women were meant. I try to make this clear by the view of the example of France. And Christina Stemmer-Rohr, she spoke about the West Germany in the 1970s, but you could also take the example of the USA or Great Britain. And as we already sit here together, I would like to talk with you. What do we do with this knowledge, with this misunderstanding within the within feminism? What do we do with that knowledge nowadays? That not everybody was always included in the political struggle.